How are we doing? Now, anyone that knows me knows that I love my football, and as an Arsenal fan, I never imagined that my first football related video would be about a Tottenham player. But if you're into football like I am, then you'll know that some things are just way more important than tribalism and rivalries. Today's video is about a man who shone on the pitch in the face of constant abuse and who then went on to the front line to fight for and defend his country. This is the life of Walter Tull. Walter Tull was born on the 28th of April 1888 in Folkestone in the southeast of England. Now, the population of black migrants in the UK was slowly growing at the time, and Walter's dad, Daniel Tull, had arrived from Barbados in the 1870s, where he married Alice Palmer. Now, the treatment of interracial couples at the time is unclear, but presumably the pair weren't very well received. Nevertheless, the couple started a family shortly after, and Walter would be their fifth child. But by the age of 9, Walter was an orphan, with his mum dying of cancer and his dad dying of heart disease just a few years later. Walter was sent with his older brother Edward to what was then the Methodist Children's Home and Orphanage in Bethnal Green, East London. From here, Edward was adopted by a family in Glasgow, and ultimately he went on to become the first person of mixed heritage to practice dentistry in the UK. But now Walter was alone in the orphanage, and he struggled. Having faced so much turmoil already in his life, he found solace in playing for the orphanage football team, and in 1908, at the age of 20, he signed for Clapton, an amateur football club playing on the Hackney Downs in East London. In 1909, Tull signed for Tottenham for just £10 and became their first black player. In a BBC4 documentary, ex-Tottenham player Garth Crooks describes how he believed that he was actually the first black player, or at least one of the first black players, to play for the club. And it was purely by chance that he came across an old team photo featuring Walter Tull. He had no idea who this man was. So Crooks went digging to find out more. He spoke to the official club historian, who also had no knowledge of Tull. It seems crazy that aside from being included in the team photos, there was apparently no knowledge of Walter Tull's time at Tottenham Hotspur. In fact, going through official historical club records, there seems to be no mention of Tull at all. But in all honesty, it speaks volumes to the place that black people were expected to hold in society. Dr. Hakeem Addy from Middlesex University talks of how racism was just part of society and wouldn't actually become illegal in Britain until the 1960s. The British Empire was strong, so Britain's influence across the world was huge. The main aim on our shores and globally was to uphold what would have been seen as traditional British values, namely the superiority of white people over black people. As I've said in previous videos, those in power tend to project their ideologies onto society through the media, whichever media is most pervasive at the time. So during Walter Tull's life, it would have most likely been through books, churches, or even comic books. And given enough time, these become society's own values. Shortly after signing for the club, he was included in Tottenham's pre-season tour of Argentina and Uruguay, where he's credited as being the first professional player of mixed heritage to play in South America. Now, contrary to popular belief, football was initially a sport for the upper classes, but by the time Tull was playing, things were changing. Football was now a working class game, and its popularity as a spectator sport was booming across the country. On the 1st of September 1909, Walter Tull made his debut for Tottenham in a 3-1 defeat to Sunderland. Tull made an instant impact on his debut, and from his early performances in a Tottenham shirt, it seemed they had signed one of the great prospects of the time, a man who was destined for greatness. Not long after signing for Spurs, Tull featured in a match against Bristol City, where he was the subject of continuous racial abuse. As we know from events in recent years with the tearing down of the Edward Colston statue, Bristol has very strong links to Britain's colonial past. According to the match report at the time, it was said that, candidly, Tull has much to contend with on account of his colour. His tactics were absolutely beyond reproach, but he became the subject of ignorant partisan. A section of the spectators made a cowardly attack upon him in language lower than Billingsgate. It was also said that he is Hotspur's most brainy forward, and that Tull was the best forward on the field. Let me tell these Bristol hooligans that Tull is so clean in mind and method as to be a model for all white men who play football. Again, like so many before him, we can see Tull holding himself with dignity and pride, and it must be said that despite Bristol's intimate connection with slavery, it's very unlikely that this was the only incident of its type that Tull would have experienced. As I've said, most of Tull's impact on football has largely been wiped, if it were ever recorded at all. But travelling up and down the country, it seems only reasonable to speculate that this would have been a common occurrence, especially when we consider the unrelenting racial abuse that later generations of black players would be subjected to. However, it was this experience with the Bristol City fans that would pretty much spell the end of his career with Tottenham Hotspur. Making only 7 appearances for the first team in the 1909 season, Tull was then relegated to the reserve team to pretty much keep him out of the limelight. Nowadays, of course, clubs are encouraged to tackle abuse of all forms so that football can be the inclusive game we all want it to be. But for Walter Tull, this support was something that wasn't afforded to him. And according to his biographer, Phil Vasily, he was seen as more of a detriment to the club's reputation, hindering the team's morale. It was simply the easy decision to remove him from the first team. On the 17th of October 1911, Tull signed for Northampton Town. As I mentioned earlier, the black population in the UK was growing, but really only in the much larger port cities where the ships would dock and their occupants would settle. Northampton was not one of these cities. In fact, for local residents, Tull was most likely the first black person they'd ever seen. I can only imagine that, given the life he'd lived so far, moving to a place where he'd be so isolated and different can't have been easy. But they took him under their wing. Over the next 3 years, he would make a total of 111 appearances for the club, 105 of them coming in the league, under the management of a man who should be familiar to most Arsenal fans, Herbert Chapman. In August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and in the December of that year, Tull volunteered his services for the British Army. There were so many examples in his life of how he didn't fit in with traditional British values and was made to feel unwelcome, and yet he didn't hesitate to defend the country that birthed him and raised him. Despite his pride and determination, there was a clear reluctance to allow him to fight. According to the Manual of Military Law in 1914, troops formed of coloured individuals belonging to savage tribes and barbarous races should not be employed in a war between civilised states. This is compounded by earlier discussions in which General Wolseley stated, "The Negroes are like so many monkeys. They are a lazy, good-for-nothing race," before later imploring, "Let us keep our British regiments strictly British. If ever we begin to fill our ranks with alien races, our downfall will most surely follow." Obviously, black people were seen as lesser, but you'd think that at a time when you need to gather as many troops as you possibly can, there would be little regard for the colour of their skin, and more attention given to their competency in battle. In fact, according to Phil Vasily, the standard procedure when black citizens were putting themselves forward for inscription would have been to fail them almost by any means necessary, make the tests so difficult that it would be impossible for anyone to pass them, and so they would seemingly be justified in failing them. But as I mentioned, football was at this time more popular than it had ever been before, and it's said that in Edwardian Britain there probably wouldn't have been many more recognisable black faces around. So given that Tull was such a recognisable figure whose physical fitness was clearly in no doubt, it would have been very difficult to fail him without questions being asked. So he passed, and he initially served in the 2 football battalions of the Duke of Cambridge's own regiment. The idea behind the football battalion was that people would be encouraged to serve alongside their football heroes. One of the provisions made for the football battalions was that they would continue to play for their clubs until the end of the season. So this meant that Tull would be training as a soldier all week before meeting up with his Northampton Town teammates to play the matches at the weekend. This would ultimately be the final season that Tull would play football, during which he managed to shine in the army, which saw him promoted to Lance Sergeant. In 1915, Tull returned to his boyhood town of Folkestone, but this time it was to board a ship to France. His battalion were on their way to battle. They were initially sent to Givenchy, an area that the troops dreaded due to the sandy terrain. This meant that the trenches they dug would have to be very, very shallow, and of course this left the troops exposed, and the death rates in this region were much, much higher. I've been lucky enough to speak to a few people who have served in the military, and one thing that always comes up is the unified spirit. Your life is in the hands of the people next to you, and equally their lives are in your hands. So you have to have complete trust and faith in each other. It's an environment that offers experiences which no one else can understand, and it seems to an extent Walter was able to feel this camaraderie, perhaps for the first time in his life. In 1916, Tull would be on the front line in the Battle of the Somme. He seemed eager to see action compared to the quieter times of war, but it was this action which caused him to be removed from the front line. Diagnosed with shell shock, what is now recognised as post-traumatic stress disorder, Walter was sent back to England. Just 5 months later, he returned to duty with a new regiment. The 1st Football Battalion had been disbanded after losing roughly half of their men in the Battle of the Somme. In November 1916, he would become the first black sergeant to undergo officer training in the British Army, and on the 30th of May 1917, once his training was complete, he was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant, becoming one of the first infantry officers of mixed heritage to serve in the British forces. It seems that prior to this there was an active block in allowing black officers to command over white soldiers. According to documents at the time, we can see reference to officers needing to be of pure European descent, specifically to prevent non-white soldiers from rising up the ranks. Now serving in the 23rd Battalion, Tull was sent to the Italian front in November 1917, where he led his 26 men on a night raid across the Piave River. Noted for being fast-flowing and treacherous, it's reported that Tull got his men across into enemy territory unharmed, as well as returning them without any casualties. For this, his gallantry and coolness was officially recognised by Major General Sidney Lawford in a citation written to Tull. This was a mission that played a significant role in the First World War, and he was recommended for a military cross, which sadly he would never receive. On the 25th of March 1918, Walter Tull was killed in action, aged just 29. It was the early stages of Germany's spring offensive on the Western Front, and despite attempts to repatriate him, his body was never recovered from the battlefield. For whatever reason, it seems military crosses can't be awarded posthumously, so without a change in the British law, Walter Tull will never be officially recognised for his incredible story. But his legacy does live on, with his name appearing on both the Folkestone War Memorial and the Dover War Memorial. He is also commemorated at the Arras Memorial alongside nearly 35,000 soldiers whose final resting place is unknown. In 1999, Sixfields Stadium, the home of Northampton Town, unveiled a Walter Tull memorial wall, prominently including a quote from his biographer, Phil Vasily, which reads, "Through his actions, W.D.J. Tull ridiculed the barriers of ignorance that try to deny people of colour equality with their contemporaries. His life stands testament to a determination to confront those people and those obstacles that sought to diminish him and the world in which he lived. It reveals a man, though rendered breathless in his prime, whose strong heart still beats loudly." My research for this video was massively helped by a BBC4 documentary called Walter Tull, Forgotten Hero, which you have to go and watch. It goes into a lot more detail about his story, and you really get a sense of what a fascinating and hard life he had. It doesn't seem to be available on BBC iPlayer anymore, but it is on YouTube, so I'll put a link to that in the description, as well as all the other sources I used to make this video. Sadly, for a long time, his story was erased from history, but as you've seen, efforts have been made by a small community to keep Walter Tull's story alive, and as with all the figures we talk about on this channel, his legacy will never die, just as long as we keep learning and keep sharing these incredible stories. From promising young footballer to valiant war hero, Walter Tull should never be forgotten. Be sure to like this video and also share it around, and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content. It really helps me out. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter at JRMediaLDN. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next one.